bring Shafeeq Ghabra in here from Kuwait City. We seem to be hearing that the options are limited for the US in terms of what they can actually do. We're also hearing that it's very difficult to support the ascension of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the royal throne. What's your view? Do you think the options are limited, or do you think the US needs to get tough and stop the ascension of the Crown Prince?
It's very hard to say in what direction things will go. But all I can see is that the assassination, the way it happened, of Jamal Khashoggi has opened an entire panoramic situation that so many questions are asked. And this does have regional implications on human rights. If you go back to 2011, the Arab populations wanted change, wanted democracy, wanted participation, wanted to have a say, and wanted to be able to say their opinion and yet be protected. And that particular Arab Spring was massacred brutally, was kind of a counter-revolution came against it. So what happened with Jamal Khashoggi tells us that human rights is a major issue in the Arab world and today in Saudi Arabia.
The Saudi Foreign Secretary in particular, Adil al-Jubeir, he's actually called this the world's reaction to Khashoggi's killing as hysterical. I want to begin with Shafeeq Ghabra in Kuwait City. Hysterical? What do you make of that kind of language?
I see in Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry a lack of diplomacy and a lack of even visibility. I mean, as you all did follow, it took several weeks before there was a statement after the Khashoggi disappearance. There was a lot of instability in the way the policy was even expressed. What happened stage by stage? So it's unfortunate to say the reaction is hysterical, yet it is very understood. There are events in history. I recall the assassination of Mr. Aquino in 1983 after 3 years of exile. And he was told to come back to his country, the Philippines, and he was assassinated in the airport. A whole movement erupted, and later on his wife, who was a housewife then, not interested and not involved in politics, led a movement and then became the elected democratic president of the Philippines in 1986. So there are events in history, and assassination can always go in that direction, human rights. But when it is coming together with the war in Yemen, the blockade with Qatar, the entire episode with Canada, the situation that happened with Lebanon, other aspects and other issues of human rights and princes and other members of the Al Sauds and others in the business community in Saudi Arabia, human rights issues, one day, someday, is going to become quite a reaction. And I think it was building up, and unfortunately, it was Khashoggi, a dear friend and a very gentle human being and a very wise man who always expressed what is always good for Saudi Arabia and for the region in a democratic human context. Unfortunately, it took his life to create a kind of opening for the whole idea of freedom of expression and representation, and to deal with all these kind of unfortunate and very archaic type of conflicts that erupted in this part of the world as a result of policies that were very adventurous in the last 3 years.
I do want to bring you both in from Kuwait City, Shafeeq Ghabra and Majilan Ansari. I'll start with Kuwait City. The idea that perhaps a better alliance for the US would be Qatar, Turkey, Iran would have seemed fanciful just 4 weeks ago. But now there are some circles in DC apparently discussing that. Do you think that's a better alliance for the US than, say, perhaps relying solely on Saudi Arabia?
Well, let me first say that the US need to bring back into the core of its policy, and that should apply US, Congress, the entire operation has to absorb again the whole issue of human rights in the region. because with human rights and the violations that have existed in the last decade or two are very much directly responsible, among other factors, definitely, to the rise of violence and instability in the region. So A, human rights. B, I think the US has to look at each state differently. So I would say there is quite a conflict on so many issues with Iran. Come back to the nuclear agreement. Try to bring this back to the table in a sensible way and create a win-win relation with Iran. There are differences with Iran. There are issues with Iran, even in the Arab world at large, from Syria all the way to other places. But it shouldn't be a zero-sum situation. It shouldn't be zero-sum. It must get to the point where a dialogue between the Gulf and Iran can take place, and the US could encourage that at one level or another. Now, come to Qatar. Yes, I believe the US has to strengthen its relation to Qatar, to Kuwait, strengthen its relation to Oman, strengthen its relation to anybody in the region. And I see the need for balance and the need for reasonable thinking and a policy that is not adventurous. And there are plenty. There are many leaders in the region. Kuwait is one of them. Qatar is another. And should find a way to stop the Yemen war, because the Yemen war is a tragedy. It is a tragedy ongoing daily, with many killed, civilians more than anything else. Destruction of an entire nation. And who's going to rebuild?